Hi, and welcome to our Week 12 video, where I'll be discussing the three texts assigned for us to read this week. They are Louise Erdrich's short story Fleur, and excerpts from two larger pieces, Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek and Art Spiegelman's Mouse. I'm actually re-recording this video in light of some of the events of this past week and as they connect to our readings, and I'll discuss that a little bit. I'll start with the piece Mouse. The excerpt that we're reading, Mouse, is a 2-volume graphic novel that looks at the Holocaust. Primarily, it is a story about the telling of a story. So it's telling a story about how stories are told to us. The character Art, fashioned after the author, the illustrator, is asking his father to share with him stories of his life now that his father is older. As what happens with many trauma survivors of the Holocaust, we see a reluctance to go into detail, to tell those stories, very much wanting to move on, especially in those generations before, easy access to therapy or before therapy was destigmatized. There wasn't this big move towards talking as a way to heal. That's very much a sort of more recent concept. Recent, several decades, but still. And so you had, I think, really beginning in the 1980s, as Holocaust survivors were aging and starting to pass, this push towards getting their stories. And of course, we still have survivors with us today, although they are much fewer in number. Mouse is about the telling of a story, telling of a story. And so in that, we see it flip around in time, and you'll see that. The excerpt that we're reading begins with Art talking with his father in modern-day America, or what was modern-day America to them. And his father, of course, is an immigrant, is married to an immigrant. Art's mother has died, so his wife was also a Holocaust survivor, his second wife. And we see a lot of the main character's Art's frustrations with his father, his inability to, this cultural divide they have, not just because of his experiences in the Holocaust, but because he's Polish and he's from a completely different world, a completely different generation, and in addition to the trauma, that he had survived, he had all of these defense mechanisms and things that prevented him perhaps from forming the kind of bond that his fully American son would have wanted. That, coupled with the fact that Art had an older sibling, a brother, I believe, who died in the Holocaust. And so we just see all of these, the ways in which loss affects us, again, for generations. That's something we've been talking about throughout this class, whether it be in context of Beloved or here. And unfortunately, I think we can't fully engage with a conversation about the Holocaust as if it were ancient history. It's not. People who suffered are still alive. But more than that, we see the seeds of what happened, the seeds that were planted in Europe in the 1930s, late 20s, early 30s. We can see those seeds again. Nationalist movements, anti-Semitic movements, and not just about Jews, of course, although this past week, the events in Pittsburgh, we see that, again, this isn't firmly in our past. An article in the Washington Post from earlier this year says that 2/3 of millennials don't know what Auschwitz is. Now, if you don't know, it's okay, don't feel shamed, but you need to know. Auschwitz was one of the biggest concentration camps in the Holocaust. I've been there. It's in Auschwitz in Poland, about an hour outside of Krakow. And in there are rooms filled with the belongings of the people, mostly Jews, but not only, who were taken there to be worked to death or killed. This includes shoes, it includes hair, includes teeth. And in one room, you look in and you see all of their luggage, which they had labeled with their names and addresses because they expected to be alive. And at the time, I was living in the Czech Republic in Prague, teaching after college, and I lived in an area called Žižkov. And I saw a suitcase with a woman's name, and it said Praha Piešt Žižkov. That's where I lived. It's not ancient. It's not untouchable. And one of the reasons we should use the opportunity to engage with literature is to better understand ourselves. Again, not just who we've been, but who we still are, the good and the bad. The shooter in Pittsburgh on Saturday, who walked into a Shabbat service in a synagogue, was fueled with anti-Semitic rage, connected in part to theories that he had been reading and participating on the internet. Completely false, erroneous, loathsome lies about how Jews were funding the migrant train now going through Mexico of people seeking help and assistance and asylum moving from Central America through to Mexico, some of them trying to come to the US, not to sneak in, but to go to the border and follow the law and present themselves and ask to be accepted, the way many of our ancestors did. Or we came and we took it, as a lot of mine did. And there are theories on the internet that are about how Jews are to blame for immigrants and Mexicans, and there's all this hate and this fear and nationalism. Nationalism is when one exalts one nation above all others, placing primary emphasis on the promotion of its culture over all other nations or other supranational organizations and pacts. And it's never turned out well. Throughout history, like, that story doesn't have a happy ending, because once we start to place one group's interests above and beyond all others, we become very comfortable with making sacrifices. We become very comfortable with identifying people as other. Be they Jews, be they Mexicans, LGBTQ, to say you are not like us. And I'm very wary of any ideology that tries to draw some great distinction between one human and another. And so we look at Maus and we look at that as evidence of nationalism, extreme nationalism. What happens? What happens when hate corrodes and influences politics, when we vote out of fear? The National Socialists in Germany were brought to power because of the Reichstag fire, in part. Reichstag fire, essentially a fire in their parliament, and there's all this fear, like, oh no, it's other groups have to get us to weaken us further after World War I. And this idea, like, we have to come together as Germans, and it's Germany first, and prioritizing of that above all else. That's the thing, is Nazis were elected. People made that choice. And I think texts like Maus allow us to see the human, and that's intended to be somewhat ironic because Spiegelman uses animal characters in place of people, and we'll be talking about why you think he does that online. Another text that we're reading is Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek. The whole book is a joy to read, and I highly recommend it. But this excerpt looks at the story of Cleophilus, who is a new bride brought over from Mexico to Tejas, Texas, with her husband Juan. And how his lack of economic opportunities and their cultural isolation leads to instances of domestic violence, and how she navigates and negotiates that. It also references, and I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it will help you read, the story of La Llorona, or the weeping woman. The story of La Llorona is really popular and common in southwestern Mexican folklore. So it's a story I grew up with my entire life. So that La Llorona is along the water, right? Sometimes ditches, but I lived along the Rio Grande. And so it was like about the river, the arroyos that come off the river, and you have to stay away, right? Because La Llorona will get you. Well, why will La Llorona get you? The story has several versions. It is sometimes about an indigenous woman who marries a Spanish soldier. Sometimes it is about a Hispanic woman, or Chicana, who marries a white soldier, depending on the time period. So New Mexico has gone through all of these, and Texas too, of course, the Southwest, has gone through all these iterations, right? It was Native, then it was Spanish, then it was Mexican. For now it's American. Who knows what else it'll be next, because borders change all the time throughout history, because borders are human created. There's nothing, there's nothing eternal about them. What is one country this year in 10 years might not be. As referencing Poland earlier, Poland stopped existing between late 1700s and at the end of World War I. Polish people existed, but Poland didn't exist. So this idea of borders as firm and everlasting, I think, especially in the Southwest, doesn't really make as much sense the way it might in other parts of the country. My grandfather was born the year New Mexico became a state. His grandfather was born when New Mexico was Mexico. There's less of, I think, a vision of the sort of absolute sanctity of borders and things like that. But to go back to La Llorona, which again is a story that goes across the border. It's Mexican, it's Texan, it's New Mexican. And so the story goes that this woman, sometimes she's given a name like Juana or Maria or something, but she is made to love the soldier, and they marry, sometimes in secret because of their differences. And she's made to feel like this will save her and that this will give her meaning. And often she's held in isolation from her community because it's always a sort of cross-cultural marriage. And there's different iterations of the story, but usually it's that he leaves her for another woman, one of his own kind. And she is held in such despair, or she's in such despair and without connections, without support, that she takes the life of her children, and then realizing what she's done, drowns herself. That's always in the water. I heard it as a well sometimes, but usually in an arroyo or the river. And sometimes the story's told like she did it out of jealousy. Other times it's like understanding that her children are of two cultures or two races, and that there is no place for any of them. And so it's usually a story about colonialism, but it's also a story about abuses of power, men and women. And so La Llorona, the ghost, she will wander the riverbanks looking for her children. And if you are down by the river or down the water where you shouldn't be, La Llorona will get you. And my grandma used to be like, oh yeah, when I was little, I was down at the river with my sister, and she got this great scratch, and probably, it was a tree, but the grandmothers, abuelas, tell the story to their grandchildren to scare them away from water so they don't drown, but also to, reinforce patriarchy. It's complicated, but knowing the story of La Llorona will help you kind of see some of the moves that the story is taking, both where you think it's going and then where it ends up going. We'll talk about that on our discussion board. And then the last story is Louise Erdrich's Fleur. And Louise Erdrich is amazing, both a short story writer and a novelist. Oh, and also a poet. So I love her, and am in awe and am jealous of her. But Fleur is a story about a Native woman who attempts to navigate a world that is no longer indigenous, right? That has been, she's not the immigrant like the previous two stories, but rather has been made to feel as almost like an immigrant through colonization. And especially as a woman, right, she has very little agency. The story, like all the stories we're reading, takes place earlier. And so she does things and makes choices to have more agency, to have more power. And systems of power don't like that. Systems of privilege and power don't like being challenged. They will go to extremes to preserve their power and to preserve their privilege. And so we'll see what happens to counter her moves, and then the only choice she has left. So the story makes a claim about what Fleur's reaction is and what the consequences are. So a lot of stuff that, when I designed the readings, I didn't think would be as topical as they are now. Abuse and harassment of women, fear of the other, anti-Semitic violence. I wish this was a history class, and I wish that we could talk about it as a distant past. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to get to work with you, to talk about some of these things and to reflect on how they shape the lives of the people around us, and maybe how we can see a better way forward. All right, I hope you enjoy the readings. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.